The receiver was not supposed to work. That is the first thing I want you to understand, because everything that followed hinges on it. The Colonial Authority surplus receiver bolted to the portside instrument bay of my freighter, Hull Registry VCF Veleth's III, had been installed by the previous owner, a survey contractor named Pelath, who ran the outer Corval routes before the margins dried up and he sold the ship to pay a debt. The receiver was a Karev 7 model, manufactured under an Earth Colonial Authority contract that expired 41 years before I bought the ship. The licensing paperwork classified it as a passive monitoring array, legacy tier, non-operational. The Colonial Authority's own database listed it as decommissioned. The firmware had not been updated in 2 decades. When I had the ship surveyed before purchase, the inspector noted it as non-functional legacy equipment, estimated its removal at 200 credits, and recommended I leave it in place as ballast rather than spend the money pulling it out. I left it in place. I am not sure I could tell you exactly why. Part of it was that I trusted old hardware the way you trust an old knife, not because it's sharp, but because you know exactly how it behaves. Part of it was that I had been flying outer Corval routes for 11 years and had developed the kind of superstition that comes from long work in empty space. You do not throw away the thing that might be listening, even if nobody told it to. But mostly, if I am being honest with myself, I left it because pulling it out required scheduling a maintenance window, and I kept finding reasons to delay the window, and eventually I stopped thinking about it. 3 years after I bought the ship, the receiver picked up a signal. I was 8 hours out of Veth Askell Waypoint, running a contracted supply transit to a Colonial Authority forward depot at the edge of the outer Corval Passage. The cargo was medical consumables and structural adhesive, 47 tons of it, nothing exotic. Nothing worth stealing in the quantities I was carrying. The transit was routine to the point of tedium. I had set the autopilot, brewed a second cup from the ship's recycled water dispenser, and was reading a technical manual for the freighter's aging reactor containment seals when the receiver's alert chimed. I nearly didn't look at it. The alert sound was not the standard Colonial Authority alarm tone. It was a lower, softer chime, the kind of tone built into old equipment for passive signal detection, designed to be noticeable without being startling, because the engineers who specified it understood that pilots on long transits were already living at the edge of their attention, and a loud alarm would simply cause them to develop a filter for it. The tone meant, something is broadcasting on a monitored frequency. It did not mean emergency. It did not mean distress. It meant the receiver had caught something worth logging. I set down the manual and looked at the display. The signal was broadcasting on what the receiver's classification table called a restricted spiritual conveyance band, an old Colonial Authority designation for a frequency range once used by alien religious orders to transmit what the early survey teams had described as prayer hymn broadcasts. The designation existed because the Colonial Authority's first contact protocols, written before anyone fully understood alien comms architecture, had carved out frequency ranges they did not want to accidentally contaminate with human traffic. The restricted spiritual conveyance band was one of those ranges. It had been set aside, monitored passively, and left alone. The Karev 7 receiver, built under that original protocol specification, was designed to catch any broadcast on those reserved frequencies and log it. That was why the Colonial Authority had installed receivers like mine on survey ships and freight runners along the outer Corval routes 60 years ago. That was why the licensing paperwork had listed mine as non-operational. Someone, somewhere in the Colonial Authority's administrative chain, had decided at some point that the restricted spiritual conveyance band monitoring program was no longer necessary, had reclassified the equipment, and had simply not sent anyone out to physically remove it. The receivers kept running. The logs kept accumulating. Nobody read them because nobody was supposed to. I read mine. The signal was a prayer hymn broadcast in the Tesshari religious conveyance format, a compressed waveform structure I recognized because I had been running outer Corvel routes long enough to have encountered Tesshari pilgrimage vessels twice before, and both times the encounter had generated enough paperwork that I had spent several tedious hours learning the basics of Tesshari comms protocol to fill out the incident forms correctly. The format uses a 3-layer harmonic structure. The outermost layer is the devotional content, the actual hymn encoded in the Tesshari tonal language. The middle layer is navigational data, coordinates, heading, speed, fuel state, broadcast as a standard part of pilgrimage protocol so that any Tesshari vessel in range can track a pilgrim ship's position. The innermost layer is a status flag. The status flag on this broadcast was set to Setha Varkel. I had to look that up. The Tesshari lexicon in my navigation database was not comprehensive. I had built it piecemeal from Colonial Authority contact summaries over 11 years, but the term appeared in 2 separate entries. The first described Setha Varkel as a devotional state indicating the completion of a spiritual journey. The second, added by a Colonial Authority contact officer, whose annotation style I recognized from other entries in my database as careful and precise, noted that in practical pilgrimage vessel usage, Setha Varkel on the status flag did not indicate completion of a journey. It indicated that the vessels had become unable to continue and was broadcasting its position and status so that other Tesshari pilgrims, or the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority, could locate it. It was the Tesshari word for stranded. I sat with that for a moment. The signal was strong enough that the receiver's signal strength indicator was reading a recent broadcast within the last 6 to 8 hours. Not a relay bounce, not a historical echo. The navigational layer gave me coordinates. I ran them through my chart system. The source was 22 hours off my current course, not in the direction of my depot run. In the opposite direction, into the outer section of the outer Corvel passage, where the Colonial Authority's navigation charts graded from solid data to survey estimates too. In the last column, the notation, minimal survey coverage, traverse at own discretion. I stared at the coordinates for a long time. The signal was not addressed to me. It was not addressed to Earth. It was not addressed to the Colonial Authority or to any human institution. It was a Tesshari religious broadcast aimed at the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority and at any Tesshari pilgrim vessel within range. The frequency band it was broadcasting on was one that human ships were specifically not supposed to use. But the monitoring program, even if nobody had told me it was still active, had been built to receive exactly this kind of broadcast. The receiver had done what it was designed to do. It had caught the signal, logged it, and generated an alert. What the receiver had not been designed to do was tell me what to do next. I checked my route obligations. The depot run was contracted. Late delivery penalties applied. The medical consumables had a use-by threshold that gave me roughly 40 days of margin. I was nowhere near it. And the structural adhesive had no time sensitivity at all. The late delivery penalty was a flat rate, not a percentage. I had enough reserve credit to cover it. I checked my communications array. The nearest Colonial Authority relay station was Earth Relay 7, which I had been routing my routine position reports through for the past 2 transits. Signal transit time to Relay 7 was approximately 4 hours. Response time from Relay 7, assuming they had any relevant assets to offer, was unpredictable. I thought about the annotation in my navigation database. The careful, precise Colonial Authority contact officer who had taken the time to note that Setha Varkel meant stranded, not completed. Someone had known that. Someone had thought it was worth writing down in a database entry that most freight runners like me would never read, because they had believed that the people who might encounter a Tesshari pilgrimage vessel in distress should know what they were hearing when they heard it. That kind of thinking, the thinking of someone who writes a note for a reader they will never meet about a situation that may never occur, because the information exists and withholding it serves no one, was the kind of thinking I had been relying on for 11 years without knowing it. Every navigation database annotation I had ever read that turned out to matter had been written by someone operating on that logic. The outer Corville routes were flyable at all because of accumulated careful thinking by people whose names I mostly didn't know. I composed a message to Earth Relay 7. I kept it factual. I stated my hull registry, my current position, the signal I had received, the coordinates I had derived, the status flag and its translation, and the fact that I was the only registered Colonial Authority freight runner currently within range of those coordinates. I attached the full receiver log and the waveform capture. I noted that I was diverting from my contracted route to approach the source coordinates, and that I was flagging this diversion under Colonial Authority Emergency Assistance Provision, Section 14, Subsection 3. The provision that allowed contracted freight runners to break route for verified distress situations without voiding their contracts, provided they filed the appropriate notice. I had never used Section 14. Subsection 3 before. I had known it existed for 11 years. I had read it the way you read emergency procedures you hope never to need. I sent the message to Earth Relay 7, updated my autopilot with the new heading, and went to check on a piece of equipment that the ship's official inventory listed as a cargo bay environmental monitor. It was not a cargo bay environmental monitor. Pelath, the previous owner, had been a survey contractor. Survey contractors on the outer Corville routes operated in territory where piracy was not common but not unknown, and where Colonial Authority patrol coverage was thin enough that a vessel in trouble might wait several days before any authority arrived. Pelath had, at some point in his survey career, made a practical decision about his own security. The equipment mounted behind the environmental monitor housing was a Colonial Authority surplus pulse emitter, rated for hull-breaching suppression at ranges up to 300 meters. It was not the kind of weapon that would threaten a warship. It was the kind of weapon that would make a piracy crew reconsider whether a freighter full of survey equipment was worth the effort. I had found it 2 months after buying the ship, had spent an afternoon verifying that it was in working order, and had then carefully not thought about it for 3 years. I thought about it now. The outer survey margin had a thin record of piracy incidents, not zero, and not the kind of pattern that would deter a careful freight runner from taking the route, but enough that a disabled vessel broadcasting its distress position for 11 hours would be visible to anyone who was monitoring traffic and thinking about opportunity. A disabled Tesshari pilgrim vessel was not a valuable piracy target on most assessments. Pilgrim ships typically carried devotional cargo and personal effects, not commercial freight. But a disabled vessel is still a disabled vessel, and there are crews who do not make careful assessments. I ran a diagnostic on the pulse emitter. It was functional. The power coupling to the main reactor was intact. The targeting array, a simpler system than the emitter itself, responded correctly to manual input. I updated the targeting firmware with the current date and verified that the Colonial Authority Equipment Authorization Code, which Pelath had apparently kept current out of old habit, was still valid for another 8 months. I noted the authorization code in my ship's log, with a brief notation that I was operating the equipment under Section 14 provision. If anything happened, I wanted the record clear. Then I went back to the flight deck and watched the hours count down. The outer Corville passage at this range from the waypoint had a particular quality of emptiness that I had never gotten entirely used to in 11 years. The inner routes, closer to the relay hubs, had enough traffic that you could expect to see 1 or 2 other vessels during a standard transit. Not close enough for anything more than a registry ping, usually, but present enough to establish that you were in a lane that other people traveled. The outer routes were different. You could go 4 or 5 transits without seeing another registered vessel, and the Colonial Authority navigation charts grading from solid data to estimates to minimal coverage was not an abstraction but a felt thing. The sense of the known world, thinning out around you the further you pushed. 11 years of outer routes had not made me indifferent to that sensation. I had just developed a relationship with it. The way you develop a relationship with any recurring feature of your working environment that is not comfortable, but is also not going away. The first response from Earth Relay 7 arrived 3 hours and 40 minutes after I sent my message. It was not from an automated acknowledgement system. It was from a duty officer named Venus Rel, whose title was listed as Colonial Authority, Outer Corval Regional Coordination, and whose message was short enough that I read it twice to make sure I had not missed something. The message said, Section 14 acknowledged. Route diversion logged. No Colonial Authority assets currently within practical response range of those coordinates. Relay 7 monitoring your position. Keep us updated. I read it a third time. No assets within practical response range. That was the entirety of what Earth Relay 7 had to offer me. A duty officer named Venus Rel was monitoring my position, and I was flying a 47-ton supply freighter with a decommissioned prayer band receiver and a pulse emitter toward coordinates in the outer survey margin, where a Tesshari pilgrim vessel was broadcasting Seth of Arkel into the dark. I composed a brief acknowledgement and sent it. Then I made another cup of coffee from the recycled water dispenser and went back to the technical manual about reactor containment seals, because there was nothing else to do for 18 more hours, and reading was better than sitting with the silence. The manual was longer than I remembered. I finished it and started it again. I found the pilgrim vessel on my approach sensors 14 hours later, while I was still 8 hours out. It was larger than I expected. Tesshari pilgrimage vessels varied widely in size depending on the scale of the pilgrimage. Individual devotional journeys traveled in small craft barely larger than my own freighter, while major inter-system pilgrimage convoys used ships capable of carrying several hundred pilgrims and their ceremonial cargo. This vessel was toward the larger end of the individual journey scale. A single hull design, roughly double my displacement, with the curved forward section and the exterior ceremonial marker lights I had seen in the Colonial Authority contact photographs. The marker lights were still active, cycling through what I assumed was their standard devotional sequence. The ship's drive section was not active. Its attitude thrusters were firing intermittently in what my navigation system interpreted as automatic station keeping. The ship maintaining its position rather than drifting, but not under propulsive power. The prayer hymn broadcast was still running. At this range, the receiver was pulling it in clearly enough that I could hear the tonal structure of the devotional layer, the actual hymn, as an audio waveform. I did not understand the Tesshari tonal language well enough to follow the content, but I had been in space long enough to recognize a sound that was meant to carry across emptiness, meant to persist, meant to keep saying, "We are here, we are here, we are here." I ran a full passive scan before approaching to within comm range. The scan showed no other vessels within sensor range, no anomalous power signatures, no objects matching the general profile of concealed vessels in the nearby debris field. If anyone else had heard the Seth of Arkel broadcast and come to look, either they had not arrived yet or they had decided the assessment was unfavorable. I noted the scan results in my log and brought the pulse emitter online on standby mode, which kept it off the active systems board, but had it ready to respond in approximately 4 seconds if I needed it. The debris field itself was to the starboard of my approach vector. I could see it on the passive scan as a diffuse scatter of returns, not dense, enough to be a navigation hazard at this range, but irregular enough that I understood how a vessel with a less than perfect chart for this sector could have clipped its edge without seeing it coming. The Tesshari Outer Passage Authority's charts for the outer survey margin were compiled from pilgrimage vessel reports, which meant they were good on established pilgrimage routes and sparser everywhere else. A route deviation of even a few hundred kilometers could put a vessel in survey estimate territory with no reliable hazard data. I noted the debris field's apparent position and extent in my log, with a note that it did not appear in my own Colonial Authority navigation chart. and that I would file a chart correction report when I was back on the inner routes with a solid relay connection. Chart corrections from freight runners were not glamorous work, and they were easy to skip. But every chart in my navigation database had been built from accumulated individual reports by people who had taken the time to file them. And I had been the beneficiary of that accumulated work often enough to understand the obligation. Then I opened a broad spectrum hail on every frequency listed in my Colonial Authority contact protocol database under Tesshari communications. Standards. I identified myself, my registry, my authority, and my position. I stated in the formal Colonial Authority contact phrasing that the protocol manual required, that I had received their Sethavar Kel broadcast and was approaching to render assistance under Colonial Authority provision. There was a pause of roughly 4 minutes. Then a voice came back on the comm. The voice was speaking Tesshari. I did not speak Tesshari. My navigation database had a basic phrase matching function, not a translation engine, and it returned a partial interpretation that gave me perhaps a third of the words as approximate equivalents. But the tone was something I could read without translation. It was the sound of someone who had been broadcasting into silence for a long time and had just received an answer and was not entirely sure, in the first moment of that answer, what to do with the fact of it. I switched to the Colonial Authority Standard Bridge Contact Protocol, which used a simplified vocabulary set that was supposed to work reasonably well with alien crews who had received any Colonial Authority contact training, and tried again. This time the response came back in that simplified vocabulary. The speaker identified herself as Warden 2nd Osteln, navigation officer of the Tesshari pilgrimage vessel Vethsethar Kel, which I noted, with the partial phrase matching I had available, translated approximately as vessel of the completed road. The vessel's propulsion system had suffered a cascade failure in the drive motivator array. The failure had been triggered by a navigational miscalculation that had taken them through the edge of a debris field not charted in their own navigation database. The debris had not struck the hull. The hull was intact, but the drive field interaction with the particulate density had destabilized the motivator array beyond the vessel's own repair capability. They had been broadcasting Sethavar Kel for 11 hours before I arrived. They had been broadcasting it at the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority. I asked carefully whether they had received any response from that authority. There was a longer pause this time. Warden 2nd Osteln's answer, translated approximately, was the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority had not responded. The Passage Authority's nearest monitoring station was 40 hours distant. The pilgrimage vessel's fuel state gave them approximately 60 hours of station-keeping capacity before the attitude thrusters would fail. After that, the debris field at the edge of this sector would become a factor. I acknowledged this information. I told her that I had notified Earth Relay 7 and that a formal distress notification would be forwarded to the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority through the Inter-Authority Contact Protocol. I did not know how long that would take to produce a response, but I wanted her to know that the notification was in transit. Then I told Warden 2nd Osteln that I was going to come alongside, and that vessel carried medical consumables and structural materials, and that I would need approximately 2 hours to assess their drive situation with whatever technical information they could share. She said she would share the technical information. Her tone, through the translation filter, was the same careful assessment register, processing, not reacting. I told her I would be there in 8 hours and closed the channel. Then I sent a second message to Earth Relay 7. I gave them the updated status. Vessel located, contact established, drive system failure, 60-hour station keeping window, nearest Tesshari Authority 40 hours out. I noted that I was proceeding with direct assistance under Section 14, and that I was requesting Relay 7 initiate a formal distress notification to the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority on the Colonial Authority's behalf, using the Inter-Authority Contact Protocol, because the Pilgrim vessel's own signal had apparently not been reaching them. I attached the receiver log again, including the full 60 hours of accumulated broadcast data, and I added a note that Relay 7 might want to know. The Karev 7 receiver on my ship had been logging restricted spiritual conveyance band traffic on this route for 3 years. There were apparently quite a few entries. I had not previously known to check them, because nobody had told me the receiver was still working. I sent the message and began my final approach. Coming alongside a vessel you have never docked with, in open space, without a common docking standard, is a slow and careful process. The Tesshari Veth Kel was not designed with Colonial Authority docking interfaces. My freighter was not equipped with any Tesshari interface adapter. What I had was a length of magnetic tether line, a surface anchor kit rated for hull materials up to Class 4 composite, and 11 years of experience with awkward cargo transfers in suboptimal conditions. I matched her attitude first. That meant reading her station-keeping pattern, the intermittent firing of her attitude thrusters, and synchronizing my own maneuvering thrusters to hold relative position while her automatic systems continued their cycle. This took 40 minutes, mostly because the Veth Kel's thrusters fired on a pattern that was slightly irregular. The cascade failure had affected some auxiliary systems as well as the main drive, and the attitude control was compensating for a partially degraded thruster cluster on the port forward quadrant. I watched the pattern for 20 minutes before I tried to match it, then spent another 20 minutes dialing in the sync. When I had it, I held position for 5 minutes without correcting to verify the match was stable, then began the tether approach. I spent 40 minutes talking Warden 2nd Osteln through the external anchor attachment procedure, using the simplified vocabulary protocol and a great deal of patient repetition. She needed to direct a crew member to the attachment point on her hull, and that crew member needed to understand what they were attaching and how firmly. The concept of a magnetic tether anchor required 4 exchanges to convey correctly, because the simplified vocabulary protocol used a contact era terminology that predated the specific anchor design I was using, and the gap between the word in the protocol and the physical object in my hand required bridging by description. We got there. The tether connected on the 3rd attempt. I ran a secondary line for redundancy, tested both under tension, and noted the readings in my log. Then I suited up, crossed the gap in a vacuum transit that my suit's telemetry recorded as 11 meters and 22 centimeters, and landed on the hull of the Veth Kel, with considerably less grace than I would have preferred. The hull material was not quite the same as Colonial Authority standard composite. There was a slight give to it under the anchor points of my suit. S-grip assist, a quality I had not encountered before, which I noted and then adjusted for. I took 30 seconds longer than planned getting stable, which mattered to me, even though no one was timing me. The airlock was not standard. The Tesshari had their own cycling protocol, which Warden 2nd Osteln talked me through over the comm, with what I was beginning to recognize as the particular careful patience of someone who was deeply uncertain about whether the person on the other end of the line was reliable, but had decided to proceed on the basis that the alternatives were worse. The interior of the vessel was not what I had expected. I had seen Colonial Authority contact photographs of Tesshari Pilgrim vessels before. The photographs showed functional spaces with ceremonial elements, marker lights mounted on structural members, devotional panels on certain bulkheads, the general architecture of a working ship with religious significance added to it. The Veth Kel was something different. The entire forward section was ceremonial space. Devotional panels covered not just certain bulkheads but every surface of 3 interconnected compartments. And the panels were not decorative additions but integrated elements. The ship had been built around them. The marker lights I had seen cycling on the exterior were the surface expression of a lighting system that ran through the entire vessel, timed to the hymn that was still broadcasting through speakers set into the overhead. There were 43 pilgrims aboard. I had not expected 43 pilgrims. The vessel's size had suggested a small devotional journey, perhaps a dozen travelers at most. But 43 pilgrims occupied the ceremonial spaces in various states of activity, some continuing their devotional practice, sitting in orderly rows with the particular focused stillness of people in active prayer. Some gathered in the forward observation area, watching the stars through the transparent forward panel, with the waiting posture of people who had run out of things to do except wait, and a small group near the passage to the engineering section who were standing in a tight cluster with the posture of people who had been arguing and had recently stopped. A figure separated from the cluster near the engineering passage and came toward me. Warden's second Ostelm was shorter than I had imagined from her voice. The Tesshari physical type I had seen in Colonial Authority contact. Photographs varied considerably, but the general characteristics were consistent. A bilateral symmetry in the upper body that gave way to a more complex arrangement of limbs in the lower section. A facial structure with sensory organs distributed more widely than human features. And a coloration range that the Colonial Authority contact database described as correlating loosely with regional origin. Ostelm's coloration was a deep gray-green with a lighter banding pattern along the sides of her head. Her silver-trim navigation officer's robe carried a sector insignia I recognized from the Outer Passage Authority contact database as belonging to the Tesshari third-tier passage routes, the outer survey corridors. She stopped 2 meters away and looked at me with a particular expression that I had come to recognize after 2 previous encounters with Tesshari crew members as the Tesshari equivalent of careful assessment. Not hostility, not gratitude. Something more considered than either, the expression of someone running a rapid calculation about what category to assign the person in front of them, and finding that the available categories did not produce a clean result. I said, in the simplified vocabulary protocol, that I was glad the tether had held and that I would like to see the drive motivator array. She said, in the same simplified vocabulary, that the drive motivator array was in the aft engineering section and that she would take me there. She said it without any preamble, without any ceremony, with the same flat functional register that I would have used to direct a repair contractor to the relevant equipment on my own ship. It was the most reassuring thing she could have said. The drive motivator array was a disaster. The Tesshari drive technology was not identical to the Colonial Authority standard, but the underlying physics were similar enough that I could follow the damage logic once Ostelm walked me through the sequence of events. The debris field interaction had not caused a single catastrophic failure. It had caused a distributed series of small failures across the motivator coil network, each individual failure within the self-repair tolerance of the system. But the combined effect of 47 small failures occurring in rapid sequence had overwhelmed the self-repair buffer and triggered a cascade shutdown. The system had protected itself by disconnecting from the power grid. It would not reconnect until all 47 failure points were cleared. The clearing process required physical access to each coil node. The tools existed aboard the vessel. The knowledge existed. Ostelm understood the system well enough to perform the repair. The problem was time. One person, working alone, could clear perhaps 8 coil nodes per hour under good conditions. There were 47 nodes. At 8 nodes per hour, the repair would require nearly 6 hours. That was well within the 60-hour station-keeping window. But Ostelm was not working alone because she lacked help. She was working alone because the pilgrims aboard were not engineers and could not be directed to assist with technical work, and because the Veth Sether Kel carried only one other crew member with engineering training, a junior drive technician named Sethavar Os, who had injured his hand in the initial debris field encounter. Nothing serious, but enough to slow his work to perhaps 4 nodes per hour rather than 8. Together, Ostelm and Sethavar Os could clear perhaps 12 nodes per hour, 4 hours of work, still within the window. But they had been working for 11 hours before I arrived, and the combination of stress and the persistent low-level concern about whether anyone was coming had taken a toll that I recognized because I had seen it in myself on long transits. The kind of exhaustion that is not physical but structural, the fatigue of sustained uncertainty. The body keeps functioning, the hands keep working, but something underneath is running on reserves that you did not know you were drawing down until the reserves begin to show. I asked Osteln to show me a coil node. She looked at me for a moment with the careful assessment expression. I said that I understood their drive technology was not identical to Colonial Authority standard, and that I would need her to supervise my work, correct my errors. I said that I had been maintaining my own ship's drive systems for 11 years, and that drive coil work, in my experience, shared certain fundamentals across different engineering traditions, the same way that a certain kind of joint or a certain kind of seal tends to fail in similar ways regardless of who manufactured it. I said that I was willing to be corrected and that I would stop immediately if she told me to stop. She showed me a coil node. The node was a cylindrical housing roughly the size of my forearm, mounted in a recessed bay along the motivator array spine. The failure mode was visible once I understood what I was looking at. A microfracture in the housing wall had allowed a trace contamination of the motivator fluid, which had disrupted the field alignment of the coil inside. Clearing it required draining the contaminated fluid, sealing the fracture with the repair compound Osteln provided, and recharging the coil field through a calibration sequence run from the node's external interface panel. The calibration sequence required me to match a specific tonal input to the node's resonance frequency. This was the point where Tesshari drive engineering diverged most noticeably from Colonial Authority standard, and Osteln corrected my first 2 attempts before I found the right approach on the third. It took me about 12 minutes to clear the first node, twice as long as Osteln's rate, with 3 corrections from her during the process. The second took 9 minutes. By the fourth, I was down to 7 minutes, close to her pace. The corrections became less frequent. I developed an internal model of the resonance calibration that seemed to hold across the different nodes I tried, and by the 7th node, I was running the calibration on the first attempt about half the time. We worked in a pattern. Osteln took one section of the array. I took an adjacent section, Sethavar Os, who had insisted on continuing despite his hand, and who worked with the concentrated deliberateness of someone managing pain by focusing elsewhere, took a third section. We did not speak much beyond what the work required. Osteln corrected me when I needed it. I asked when I was uncertain rather than guessing. Sethavar Os occasionally conferred with Osteln on a technical question in Tesshari that I could not follow, and twice I heard a word in those exchanges that my phrase-matching database tentatively flagged as something like unexpected or does not match. The 47 pilgrims continued their devotional practice in the forward compartments. The hymn continued to broadcast through the overhead speakers. The marker lights cycled through their sequence. None of it had stopped for the 11 hours of Sethavarkel broadcasting, and none of it stopped now. I found myself somewhere in the 3rd hour of coil work, noticing the rhythm of the marker lights in the way you notice ambient sound after a long time. Not as distraction, but as background, something that the space had been doing continuously, and that I had simply not registered until I stopped focusing on the work for a moment. The word Sethavarkel, I remembered from the phrase-matching database, translated approximately as the completed road. The vessel was named for it. The status flag was named for it. The junior technician's name contained it. I found myself wondering whether, in the Tesshari framework, the difference between stranded and completed was considered a meaningful distinction, whether the state of being unable to continue a journey was categorized differently from the journey's actual end, or whether, in the religious logic of the pilgrimage tradition, they were the same category of thing, a pause that might or might not resolve into continuation. Whether the name Sethavar Kel for a distress state implied that the naming tradition did not regard distress as a terminus, but as a specific kind of moment on a road that was still underway. I did not ask Osteln about this. It was not the right time for theological questions. But I thought about it while my hands worked. The response from Earth Relay 7 arrived 4 hours and 20 minutes after my second message, relayed through my ship's comm system to a handheld unit I had clipped to my suit before crossing the tether. The message was from Venus Rel again. It was longer than the first one. Venus Rel confirmed that Relay 7 had transmitted a formal distress notification to the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority using the Inter-Authority Contact Protocol, and that the authority had acknowledged receipt and was dispatching a technical recovery vessel, transit time estimated at 36 hours from dispatch. Relay 7 was logging my assistant's action under the full Section 14 provision and would process the route deviation reimbursement. The late delivery penalty on my contracted run was formally waived under the emergency provision. Then Venus Rel said something that I read 3 times before I understood its implications. The Karev 7 receiver log I had attached to my messages, the 60 hours of restricted spiritual conveyance band monitoring data from this transit, plus whatever had accumulated before I had thought to check, had been forwarded to the Colonial Authority's Historical Records Branch on Earth. Venus Rel noted that the Historical Records Branch had apparently been looking for exactly this kind of data. The outer Corval route had been under-surveyed for decades on the question of Tesshari pilgrimage traffic patterns, and the accumulated receiver logs from the Colonial Authority surplus units on freight runners in this corridor, most of which, it turned out, were still operating in the same condition as mine, logged and ignored, represented 60 years of pilgrimage traffic data that no one had collected. Someone had now asked the Historical Records Branch to collate it. Venus Rel's last line said, the Colonial Authority Records Office would be reaching out regarding the full receiver log archive. They would like to know if my receiver had been running continuously or with interruptions. I sat with this for a moment in the engineering section of the Veth Sethar Kel, with 17 coil nodes cleared and 30 remaining, while Warden's second Osteln worked 6 meters away, and the marker lights cycled their devotional sequence overhead. Then I composed a brief reply to Venus Rel. The receiver had been running continuously since I bought the ship. Before that, Peleth had owned the ship for 8 years, and I had reason to believe the receiver had been operational throughout his ownership. Before that, the ship's registry showed 2 previous owners whose contact information I would look up and forward. The receiver had been installed at the factory under the original Colonial Authority contract. That contract, if I remembered the original documentation correctly, had gone into effect 61 years ago. I sent the reply and went back to the coil nodes. We finished the array 3 hours and 40 minutes later, 47 nodes, cleared and verified. Sethavar Os ran the reconnection sequence from the engineering console. The motivator array came back online without drama, a steady power draw, a clean handshake with the drive control system, a green status on every board. Osteln stood at the main engineering display for a moment after the confirmation appeared, watching the readout with the particular stillness of someone who has been carrying a weight and has just set it down. I did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. I checked the diagnostic display, confirmed the same readings she was looking at, and began collecting my tools. She said in the simplified vocabulary that the vessel was in their debt. I said, in the same simplified vocabulary, that the debt was the Colonial Authorities, and specifically the debt of a contact officer, named whoever they were, who had taken the time to write a careful annotation in a navigation database about the meaning of the word Sethavar Kel. Without that annotation, I would not have known what I was hearing when the receiver alarmed. She looked at me with the careful assessment expression for a moment. Then she said something in Tesshari that my phrase-matching database could not fully parse, but returned as approximately. That is an unusual answer. I said that the unusual answers were usually the accurate ones. She did not respond to this, but the careful assessment expression shifted, very slightly, into something that I'd not have a phrase-matching reference for, and could not categorize from the Colonial Authority contact photographs. I logged it mentally as something to think about later. The return crossing on the tether was easier than the outbound. I had the geometry memorized now, and the anchor points were set correctly. I cycled back through my airlock, stored the vacuum suit, and went to the flight deck. Veth Setherkel's drive was already cycling through its warm-up sequence. I could see the engine glow building at her aft section through the flight deck viewport, a deep amber color against the surrounding dark. There was something in watching it that I recognized as the visual equivalent of the sound Sethavarkel. The road resuming after the pause. I sent a final status update to Earth Relay 7, drive repair complete, Tesshari recovery vessel en route, vessel self-sustaining. My assistants concluded. I noted my intention to resume my contracted route and estimated my revised arrival at the Colonial Authority depot at 31 hours from now. I began releasing the tether lines. The comm opened. It was Ostelm, she said in the simplified vocabulary. The pilgrimage vessel, Veth Setherkel, had been recording its broadcast continuously since the Sethavarkel status was declared. The broadcast included, as part of its navigational layer, a full log of the vessel's distress period. Under Tesshari pilgrimage protocol, a vessel that completed a journey after a Sethavarkel period was required to file a record with the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority documenting the event and how it was resolved. She would be including my ship's registry, the Colonial Authority provision under which I had acted, and the name of the duty officer at Earth Relay 7 in her filing. I said that was not necessary. She said that it was required under protocol. I said I understood, and that she should proceed as protocol required. There was a brief pause. Then she said something else in Tesshari that my phrase-matching database returned as two fragments. One was approximately the phrasing for something that had reached its destination, and the other was a word I did not have a reference for at all. I asked carefully what the second word meant. She said, in the simplified vocabulary, that it did not translate cleanly. The closest approximation she could offer was the state of being found by something that was not looking for you. I said I thought I understood. She closed the comm. The tether lines came free. The Veth Setherkel's drive built to operational power. She turned, slowly and carefully in the way of a large vessel, regaining its confidence, and began moving on the heading that her navigation system had been waiting to run for 14 hours. I watched her drive section diminish against the star field until the amber of her engine glow was indistinguishable from the other points of light in that direction. Then I updated my autopilot with the depot heading, made a third cup of coffee from the recycled water dispenser, and sent a message to Peleth's last known contact address. I had no idea if it was still current. His forwarding information in the ship's registry was 3 years old. But the message was short. I told him that the receiver he had left installed on the ship had turned out to be worth more than 200 credits. I told him I was glad I had not pulled it out. I did not hear back from him. Venus Rel at Earth Relay 7 sent a follow-up message 2 days later, after I had delivered the medical consumables and structural adhesive to the depot and was on my return transit. The Historical Records branch had begun reviewing the Outer Corval Receiver Log Archive. 23 freight runners operating on this route had been identified as carrying Karev 7 units in the same non-operational listed condition as mine. All 23 had been contacted. All 23 had confirmed their units were still functional. The combined log archive, once the Historical Records branch finished the initial collation, was expected to cover approximately 60 years of continuous monitoring data across the full outer section of the Outer Corval Passage. Venus Rel noted, with the careful phrasing of a duty officer who had thought about how to characterize something correctly, that the Historical Records branch had also forwarded the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority a summary of the archive's existence and scope. The authority had not previously known that this monitoring data existed. The summary had apparently been received with a degree of interest that Venus Rel described, carefully, as considerable. She noted that the Colonial Authority's Inter-Authority Relations Office was now involved. She noted that the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority had formally thanked Earth Relay 7 for the distress notification forwarding and had inquired about the status of the Section 14 assistance action. She noted that the Colonial Authority was preparing a formal summary of the Veth Kel incident for its Inter-Authority Contact Archive. Then she noted one more thing at the end. In the slightly different register that duty officers use when they are recording something that they find personally interesting, but are not sure how to classify officially, the contact officer who had written the annotation in the navigation database about the meaning of the word Sethavar Kel, the one I had mentioned in my reply, had been identified. The annotation was dated 43 years ago. The officer's name was listed in the Colonial Authority records as Warden First Veth Askell Corvell, a contact specialist who had worked the outer Corvell survey routes in the early period of the monitoring program. Venus Rel had checked the officer's service record. Warden First Corvell had spent 11 years on the outer routes and had filed extensive contact notes throughout her service, most of which were still in the navigation database under her name. She had retired from Colonial Authority service 38 years ago. She was, Venus Rel noted, still alive, currently residing at a Colonial Authority pensioners' settlement near the relay hub at the edge of the inner Corvell Passage. I sat with this for a long time on the return transit. I thought about the kind of work that Warden First Corvell had apparently done for 11 years, flying the outer routes, encountering things that the Colonial Authority's official protocols did not fully account for, and writing notes for a future reader who might need them, not filing formal reports. Those would have been in a different part of the database, cross-referenced and indexed. These were database annotations, the unofficial layer, the notes that a professional who understands their field adds to the official record, because the official record is not complete enough on its own. They required a specific kind of judgment, the judgment of someone who could distinguish between what the protocol said and what the situation required, and who trusted that a future reader would be capable of the same distinction. 43 years of those notes sitting in a navigation database that most freight runners never read all the way through. Then I composed another message, not to Earth Relay 7 this time, to the Colonial Authority pensioners' settlement near the relay hub, care of one Warden First Veth Askell Corvell, retired. I told her that I was a freight runner on the outer Corvell routes. I told her that I had been carrying a Karev Sefen receiver for 3 years without knowing it worked. I told her that 3 days ago it had alarmed, and that I had looked up the meaning of the word it caught in a navigation database entry she had written 43 years ago, and that the annotation had told me what I needed to know. I told her that 43 pilgrims were on their way to wherever they had been going, on a road they had thought was completed. I told her that I thought she should know. The message was in the queue for 4 days before I had a relay connection strong enough to transmit it. By then, I was back on the inner Corvell route, running a new contracted transit, and the Veth Sethar Kel was wherever pilgrimage vessels go when they have finished being stranded. A response came back 12 days later, routed through 3 relay stations and a Colonial Authority administrative hub. It was short. The handwriting in the electronic draft function was the careful, precise style I recognized from the navigation database annotations. It said, "I wrote those notes for people who might need them. I did not know if anyone ever read them. I am glad one reached you at the right time. Keep flying the outer routes. The receivers are still listening." I have kept that message in a separate file on the flight deck console, where I keep things I want to be able to find quickly. The file has 3 items in it. One is the Colonial Authority Section 14 provision, which I reread at the start of every transit now, the way you reread a tool's manual, after you have finally had occasion to use it. One is the phrase-matching entry for Sethavar Kel, with the annotation that says it means stranded, not completed. And one is the message from Warden First Corvell. Earth Relay 7 sent a final administrative notice 6 weeks after the incident. The Colonial Authority and the Tesshari Outer Passage Authority had signed a memorandum of understanding regarding the Outer Corvell monitoring archive. The archive was being formally integrated into the Inter-Authority Navigation Data Sharing Framework. Tesshari pilgrimage vessels operating on the outer routes would be provided with updated frequency band information. The Colonial Authority was reviewing the equipment classification status of the Karev 7 receivers. The notice said, in the standard administrative language that duty officers use when they want to be accurate without being dramatic, that the Karev 7 monitoring program, which had apparently never formally concluded, despite the equipment reclassification, despite the lapsed licensing, despite the 60 years of accumulated logs that nobody had been reading, was considered retroactively active. It had been retroactively active for 60 years. I thought about that for a while. The monitoring program had been running in the background of every freight run on the outer routes for 6 decades. Logging signals that nobody was supposed to be logging anymore. Flag-agging broadcasts that nobody was supposed to be monitoring, accumulating a record of every devotional broadcast, every navigational layer, every Sethavar Kel status flag that had crossed the outer Corvell passage, and not one of those logs had been read, because nobody knew the receivers were still listening. The Veth Sethavar Kel had been the 48th Sethavar Kel flag in the archive. I looked up the other 47. 22 had been resolved. The log showed a subsequent change in the status flag indicating resumed transit. 14 had no follow-up in the record. The log showed the broadcast continuing until it dropped below signal threshold, which could mean the vessel had moved out of range or could mean something else. 11 were in the outer survey margin, where my charts graded from solid data to estimates to minimal coverage. I filed a report with Earth Relay 7 about the 11 unresolved logs in the outer survey margin. I noted that the dates ranged from 11 years ago to 38 years ago, and that I did not know what they represented, but that the information was available if the Inter-Authority Contact Office wanted to include it in the Memorandum of Understanding discussions. Venezuela acknowledged the report. She said the Inter-Authority Office would review it. I went back to running the outer routes. The Karev 7 receiver is still installed in the portside instrument bay. The Colonial Authority sent a firmware update, the first one in 20 years, which I installed on a maintenance window that I actually scheduled this time instead of finding reasons to delay. The receiver now logs to a Colonial Authority central archive as well as its local storage. The alert chime is the same tone it has always been, the low, soft chime designed to be noticeable without being startling. I notice it now. Every time it sounds, I look. It has alarmed twice more in the months since the Veth Sethavar Kel. Both times it caught devotional broadcasts on the restricted spiritual conveyance band. Routine pilgrimage traffic. Navigational layers showing vessels on normal transits. Status flags that translated, as nearly as my phrase matching could determine, as something like progressing well. I logged both, forwarded both to the Colonial Authority archive, and filed the reports. Venus Rel sent brief acknowledgments. No action required, but I checked. I will keep checking. Not because anyone has formally required it, though the updated licensing agreement does specify that operators of Karev 7 equipment should review active alerts within a reasonable time frame. I will check because Warden First Corvell wrote those navigation database annotations for people who might need them without knowing if anyone ever read them. Because someone 60 years ago specified a chime tone designed to be noticeable without being startling, on the theory that the pilot who needed to hear it would be at the edge of their attention, and a loud alarm would teach them to stop listening. Because the Tesshari language has a word for the state of being found by something that was not looking for you, which suggests that being found in that way is a thing that happens often enough to need naming. I have thought about that phrase more than is probably warranted, given that it came to me through a two-layer approximation. Osteln's simplified vocabulary translation of a Tesshari concept, filtered through my own phrase-matching database. The translation could be wrong at either stage, but the concept it points to, if the approximation is at all accurate, is not a simple one. It is not the same as being found by something that was looking for you, which is the normal category. Search, locate, assist. And it is not the same as a collision or an accident, which implies randomness and no intentional actor. It is specifically the state of being found by something that had not set out to find you. But that was, as a condition of its ordinary function, the kind of thing that could find you, and did. The Colonial Authority monitoring program was not looking for the Veth-Sethar Kel. It was not looking for any specific vessel. It was listening, which is a different activity. Listening does not require an object. It requires only the capacity to receive, maintained continuously, in the hope, or the habit, or the institutional memory that something worth receiving might pass through. 60 years of listening. Not one person on the outer routes knew the program was still active. The receivers did not know they were unusual. They did not know they were the last of their kind still running. They were doing what they had been built to do, with no particular awareness of the significance of their persistence. And when the signal came, they caught it and generated the alert, and waited for someone to look. I am aware that I am attributing qualities to a piece of hardware that it does not possess. The receiver is a machine. It does not wait. It does not hope. It processes inputs and generates outputs according to its firmware. And the firmware was written by engineers who are probably dead by now, following a specification written by administrators who are certainly dead, in service of a monitoring program that the Colonial Authority had officially concluded before I was born. But I was born and I bought the ship, and I did not pull out the receiver, and the receiver caught the signal, and I looked. The Tesshari have a word for that. I do not think it is a coincidence that the word exists in a tradition organized around pilgrimage, around the idea that a journey is not simply transit from one place to another, but a specific kind of motion through a space that has meaning, that the road carries something more than the traveler's weight, that arriving somewhere is not the same as having completed the road. A tradition like that would have reason to notice the difference between being found by something that was searching and being found by something that was simply present and had been present all along, doing its quiet work in the background of the passage. The Veth-Sethar Kel went where she was going. I went back to my contracted route. The monitoring program is still running. I think it will be running for a long time yet. The receivers are still listening, so am I.